Picture this. You walk into any grocery store in America. Chicken, beef, pork, rows and rows of it. But there's one meat you'll almost never see. Rabbit. And here's the crazy part. Rabbit might be the smartest meat on the entire planet. Think about that. The most efficient animal we could possibly eat. And we just don't. Why? Stay till the end. Because the last part will completely change how you think about the food on your plate. Let's start with something wild. A single rabbit is basically a protein-making machine. She takes a few pounds of grass and turns it into a pound of meat faster than almost any animal alive. But it gets stranger. She can get pregnant again just hours after giving birth. Hours. She can pop out a brand new litter every single month. 6 babies, sometimes 12. And in just 12 weeks, those babies are ready for the table. Let that sink in. No other farm animal on Earth comes close to that math. Now compare that to a cow. A cow is pregnant for 9 months. Then it grows for another year and a half. It drinks oceans of water. It eats mountains of feed. And after all that, it gives you 1 calf. 1. A rabbit does all of it in a fraction of the time with a fraction of the space and a fraction of the water. In theory, 1 female rabbit and her babies could produce more meat in a single year than a cow makes in its entire life. Sounds impossible, but the numbers are real. And it doesn't stop there, because rabbit meat itself is almost too good. It's leaner than chicken, leaner than beef, leaner than pork, higher in protein than all 3, lower in fat, lower in cholesterol. If you designed the perfect healthy meat in a lab, you'd probably end up with rabbit. And this isn't some secret nobody knew. Governments knew, nutritionists knew. Back in the 1940s, health experts were practically begging families to eat it. Cheap, lean, fast to raise, even in a tiny city backyard. On efficiency, rabbit was winning. On nutrition, rabbit was winning. On cost, rabbit was winning. It was crushing every category at once. So how on earth did it vanish? Let's rewind to World War II. Meat was rationed everywhere. Families were desperate for protein, and the government had an idea: raise rabbits. The US Department of Agriculture handed out pamphlets, titles like Domestic Rabbit Raising. They told families to build little hutches in the backyard. Fast, cheap, high-protein food. In Britain, it went even further. Rabbit clubs popped up in nearly every town. Neighbors traded tips. Kids fed the rabbit scraps. And here's the key. Rabbits weren't rationed the way beef and pork were. So, for a few years, tens of millions of people were eating rabbit regularly, and nobody thought it was weird. It was just dinner. Then, the war ended, and something bizarre happened. Rabbit didn't slowly fade away. It crashed. Within a couple of decades, rabbit went from a normal dinner to something most people had never even tasted and weren't sure they wanted to. Meanwhile, a chicken exploded. Chicken became the most popular meat in both countries. Even though pound for pound, chicken is actually less efficient to raise than rabbit. So, what happened? What killed rabbit? The first answer is a horror story. In the 1950s, a virus appeared. It was called myxomatosis, and it was brutal. It caused severe swelling, blindness, a slow, visible, agonizing death. Here's the twist. Humans released it on purpose, originally in Australia, to control the wild rabbit population. But viruses don't respect borders. It spread. It jumped from wild rabbits to farm rabbits, and it reached Britain in 1953. What happened next was staggering. Within just 2 years, myxomatosis wiped out an estimated 99% of Britain's wild rabbits. 99% newspapers printed photos. Rabbits blinded. Rabbits dying in open fields. And the public reaction was not what anyone expected. People weren't relieved. They were horrified. Animal welfare groups called it cruel, needlessly cruel. And for millions of people, something shifted deep inside. The image of a suffering rabbit fused with the animal itself. Remember, these were the same people who just spent years eating rabbit for dinner. Now, that same animal was tied to a disturbing, disfiguring disease, and it did lasting damage. But here's the thing. Disease alone doesn't explain it because the outbreaks eventually faded, and rabbit still never came back. So something deeper was going on. To find it, you have to look away from the farm and look at the living room. After the war, people had more money, more comfort, and more families could afford something new: pets. And guess what became one of the most popular pets of all? Rabbits. Small, soft, quiet, easy to keep in a little hutch in the yard. Perfect for children. Now, think about the timing. At the exact moment, rabbit farming was dying. Rabbit keeping was booming. The same animal. Two completely opposite lives. And then culture did the rest. Peter Rabbit had been charming kids since 1902. Bugs Bunny showed up in 1940. Quick, clever, lovable, always outsmarting the hunter trying to eat him. Thumper hopped into Bambi in 1942. So, an entire generation grew up. And in their minds, rabbits weren't food. They were friends. They had names. They had personalities. And in the cartoons, they always won. Psychologists actually have a name for what happens here. They call it the meat paradox. It's the discomfort of loving animals while also eating them. And our brains hate that discomfort. So, we solve it with a mental trick. We sort animals into two boxes: food and not food. And here's the catch. Once an animal lands in the not food box, it stays there forever, no matter how efficient or practical eating it would be. Think about it. Pigs are as smart as dogs. Maybe smarter. Cows form friendships. They hold grudges against specific individuals for years. But none of that saves them, because in our imagination, they were never pets. The line was never really about intelligence. It was never really about efficiency. It was about exposure, which animals we grew up loving as characters, instead of counting as dinner. But there's a second reason, and this one has nothing to do with feelings. It's about factories. Chicken didn't just win because people liked it. Chicken won because it was easy to build a machine around. Chickens grow fast. They're small and uniform. They roll down an assembly line perfectly. Rabbits, not so much. Their bodies are oddly shaped. Their bones are delicate. They shatter in machinery built for other animals, and slaughtering them at speed took way more manual labor. So even though a rabbit is incredibly efficient at making meat, the economics of scale never worked. Not in America, not in Britain. Rabbit stayed small, local, old-fashioned, while chicken became an empire. Supply chains, marketing budgets, fast food giants, all built around one bird. Now, here's where the story flips. Because that whole idea, we don't eat rabbit, it's not actually true. Not worldwide. It's only true in a tiny slice of the planet. In France, rabbit is completely normal. It sits in ordinary grocery stores right next to chicken and pork. Italy has rabbit dishes going back centuries. Spain eats it. Portugal eats it. China eats it. Parts of Latin America eat it. No hesitation, no drama. In fact, China alone eats more rabbit than the rest of the world combined. Hundreds of millions of rabbits a year without a second thought. So, the real question isn't, why don't humans eat the most efficient meat? Because humans do. The real question is much smaller. Why did two specific countries, the US and the UK, spend an entire century building an emotional wall around one animal? Right when that animal was proving it might be one of the smartest foods on Earth. And people have tried to tear that wall down. In the 2000s, chefs fought back. Food writers pushed hard. They rebranded rabbit as ethical, sustainable, the eco-friendly alternative to beef. Exactly the pitch its efficiency always deserved. Fancy restaurants in London and New York quietly added it. They called it a delicacy, not a wartime meal, and almost none of it worked. Because it turns out a childhood cartoon is stronger than any marketing campaign, no matter how good the argument is. And once you really see this, Rabbit stops being a story about food and becomes something much bigger. A window into how random our food rules actually are. There is no law of nature that makes a cow dinner and a rabbit a companion. There's no nutrition rule that puts chicken on a plate and a rabbit on a couch. Those lines were drawn by a handful of cartoons, a terrifying disease, and a set of factories built around a different animal. At a moment in history when it could have gone either way, and now the planet is under pressure, land is shrinking, water is running low, and the demand for protein keeps climbing. So, some researchers are asking a bold question. Maybe it's time to redraw that line. Maybe the animal that quietly beats almost all our livestock deserves a second look. wartime, pamphlets, and all. Because here's the part that should stick with you. For a few short years in the 1940s, none of this was strange. Families raised rabbits in the yard, gave them scraps, ate them for dinner, and it worked perfectly. The efficiency was never the problem. The animal was never the problem. What changed wasn't the rabbit. What changed was us. We didn't stop eating rabbit because of science. We stopped because we fell in love with a cartoon. We don't decide what's food with logic. We decide it with feelings, with memories, with the stories we were told as kids. And once you know that, you'll never look at your dinner plate the same way.